Right, Ethan, welcome back to the podcast.
Yep, thanks for having me on again. It's been a while, but definitely glad to be back on.
Yeah, me too. We got some exciting topics in store today. Wanted to pre-frame it a bit. How it's coming up for me right now, and I think this will kind of initiate it, is we're speaking about some sort of metaspirituality where we take the insights and the feeling of exploring existence or just exploring existence at large, and kind of how that plays into many different belief systems, paradigms, different ways of going about the world. And kind of how this comes up for me is like a lot of times spirituality these days is kind of thought of in the mainstream hippie spirituality, right? And so when someone thinks of spirituality, it's often either a very strongly religious context or a very strongly like almost like new age, everything is one, kind of lacking depth, but trying to get at the truths in Eastern philosophy and different religions and stuff like that. So what I think it feels like we're attempting to do today is to move beyond that and to say, all right, there's like these core truths and these core explorations within different spiritual communities and different practices. And how does that relate to and is interconnected with all of these other paradigms and all of these other things that may not seem spiritual on the surface level, but maybe if you go deep, a couple layers deeper into spirituality, there's actually a lot of connections there. That's what it seems like we will be exploring today.
Yeah, definitely looking at the core truths that all these different traditions are kind of like pointing to, or you could say that they kind of like extend off into, but don't always necessarily reach. It's kind of like the old mantra of a finger pointing to the moon, like they may not reach the moon sometimes, but they do all reference it. But then also I would add on top of that. So yeah, we're looking at the core stuff and sort of like the moon that they're all pointing to, but also I would say it can be good to look at, not just the core moon that they're pointing at, but also like what each of the fingers are. I guess if that makes sense, like because they're valuable in their own ways also, so it's like you have a core truth in each of these various traditions, but then there's also certain areas where each one is kind of valuable. I guess you could say they bring up like their own diverse, unique skill set. Like just as a quick example, I mean, we'll talk about it later in the podcast, but like let's say you want to learn let's say something that doesn't have really anything to do with the core truth of reality. Let's say you just want to learn astral projection or something like that. you know Something like non-duality is not going to be very valuable for that, right? You almost have to study the more hippie kind of new agey traditions that you were talking about in order to learn a skill set like astral projection or try and learn it. So it's like on the one hand you have this core truth that they're all looking at, but on the other hand each one provides this diverse skill set that I guess you can sort of work with depending on what you're trying to develop, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think how this is coming up for me is like there's some intentions and there's some conversations I've had in the past about like, all right, like the perennial philosophy, all right, you have this core perennial philosophy of all these different religions, and there's kind of I sense there's this attempt to like try to create some perfect practice or to try to integrate the traditions in a way that more effectively in the modern age gets to that one truth. But I think what we're speaking on here, and I sense is very valuable as well, is actually the diversity of different approaches. Kind of maintaining that is also important, right? And so within different contexts, different things are going to be valuable to try to say that they're all equally valuable in getting to non-duality, or kind of assuming that non-duality is the goal at all times, I think maybe potentially can be problematic in that maintaining the integrity of the diversity of practices and understanding the different aspects and states and experiences of reality that they're getting at, which are oftentimes different, right? I think that it seems very important. And so
yeah, I mean, first of all, I will say I definitely do agree with everything you just said there. I almost like to think of it like like you see like those beams of white light shooting through like a prism, and then on the other end they kind of they split off into all the different wavelengths of colors like the rainbow. Like the way I like to think of it is you want the purified, sort of combined white light, like the core truth that all the traditions speak about. But then you also want the rainbow. You want to make sure, like you said, that the diversity is there as well. So it's almost like you want each side of the prism. You want the pure white light side, and then you want the post prism kind of split diverse side as well, sort of like a more wholesome unification of the two, I guess.
Right. No, I feel that as well. And something that came up for me recently after psychedelic experience was, it's almost like once you go all the way, you have a glimpse of the absolute, and you see kind of the nothingness and the nothingness beyond all of the form, right? Then there's kind of there's this like also this other end of it, which is like, all right, I've seen the nothingness, and now I actually have the opportunity to go back into form, into the diversity, into the rainbow, and to actually explore all of the different aspects of form and different approaches that, when combined, make up this nothingness and this absolute grounds of all being in reality. And so, yeah, I think I'm sensing the direction is maybe diving more into the specifics of that, into the specifics of the rainbow. What are potentially some specific different paradigms, different ways of approaching life that may not seem spiritual at the core, but actually help in experiencing the diversity of spiritual experience, of the diversity of experience within existence, and of, is that enough to work on?
Yeah, definitely. And there was something you said there at the beginning too about like the form and the formlessness, and that's almost like you could say like the ultimate unification, to kind of like merge form with formlessness, or oneness with manyness, sort of like a oneness and a unification so broad that it's one with manyness and even oneness itself. So kind of like a super oneness or something like that. And that's not anything new. That's actually something that's been, I think, written about and spoken about through various core spiritual traditions throughout history. I mean, even Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha, he was quoted as saying things like Nirvana equals Samsara. So it's like, Nirvana is not some domain to escape off into. It's not separate from Samsara. It's not separate from the world of forms. This Nirvana, this formlessness, is like completely meshed with it. It's one with it. So it's like you have the formless Nirvana being one with the forms and cycles of Samsara. And so, I think that's definitely something to keep in mind as we go about, I guess, talking about the core truths of each tradition, in addition to their diverse forms that I guess you find in sort of like a samsaric sense, if you could say.
Right. Yeah, I heard this explained in a fascinating way recently with the Buddhist experience, which was like, he was in the world of pleasure, and when he was born, he was born up in this like royal family or whatever, in this very closed off environment. He experienced so much pleasure, and then he actually went out into the world, right? And then he did like self-denial, and he tried to experience nirvana through self-denial, and then he kind of went back and tried to, and those are like polarities, right? Which is like the pleasure and the denial, and kind of people think of like the middle way as like kind of in between the two, but it was actually explained recently as like those are two polarities, and he was actually trying to transcend the polarity, right, of self-denial and self-pleasure in order to get to some sort of in the world, but also in a state of nirvana, samsara and nirvana. And what was coming up for me as well as you were saying that, which I think would be a good jumping off point, which may lead to further conversation in the same question that I asked you just before this, is I would love to explore the concept of solipsism. And so you recorded a couple of videos on this, and I found them fascinating. And then before we started, we were speaking on potentially different forms of spirituality where the ego is seen as valuable, or potentially different metaphysical conceptions of the world that aren't solipsistic, right? That are potentially, and so like kind of assuming only that solipsism is real could potentially also be a trap. So I would love to explore, like, how are you viewing solipsism, And then how are you viewing maybe how that relates to different traditions that maybe are less solipsistic, but could be equally just as valuable? And because this trap of solace, I wouldn't call it maybe it's a trap, maybe there's a trap there, but I've noticed myself definitely, if it intuitively feels somewhat like a trap, when I get in an extreme solipsistic state. For anyone that doesn't know, it's like only my experience is real, right? And so you get in this extreme solipsistic state of the only thing I can ever know is my own experience and my own existence. And so therefore kind of discounting everything else that's outside, that is perceived as outside of my experience, or even other people's experience. I'm speaking to you right now, and if you take solipsism to its extreme, then like that could potentially be harmful in how we're understanding relationships and interacting with other people. And so I'm curious to hear what comes up for you in terms of that question / rant.
Yeah. So my whole take on solipsism, it definitely ties into what we were just going over, kind of, all these different polarities being unified or transcended. So what I would say there is solipsism would just, I guess, be like one end of that polarity. Like, so it's this idea that only the present moment exists. Now, I should say here that's a little bit different from like the classical philosophical idea of solipsism, because solipsism, as it was originally conceived, was not really like a belief system or form of spirituality. It was just a specific take on philosophy that Rene Descartes was famous for noting, that, the only thing that I can be certain of is the existence of my own mind, like the whole phrase of I think, therefore I am. So solipsism did not start off as a belief that no other minds exist. It just started off as this recognition that your mind is the only one that you're certain exists. From there, you can believe that other minds exist, or you cannot believe that they exist. So working with that original definition of solipsism, you can be a solipsist and still believe in the existence of other minds. It's just that you're going to recognize that it's merely a belief. You're not certain that those other minds exist, even if you believe in them. The only mind that you're certain exists is your own. But definitely in the spiritual community lately, I've seen some spiritual teachers kind of taking solipsism and almost modifying it into something else, where it's no longer just a recognition of the certainty of your own mind. It's taking that a step further and claiming that they're certain that other minds don't exist. So there's this idea of this solipsistic awakening, which has kind of started to come about in the spiritual community. These people who say that they've awakened to this state of consciousness where not only are they certain that their mind exists, as is the case with classical solipsism, but they've managed to become certain that no other minds exist. And now, of course, people will debate that, like, how could you be certain that other minds don't exist without going outside your own mind? But we can kind of look past that for now. Let's just give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's just say that these people really have awakened to a state of consciousness that does provide them with a method where they are certain that no other minds exist. So basically, this would mean that solipsism is the absolute truth, that your mind is the only one that exists. There are no other experiences going on besides your own. Now, even if reality were like that, it can still kind of get even more flexible than that, because let's just look at, this idea that, if reality is infinite, let's just say like reality is like this infinite consciousness and it's capable of, creating or thinking up all sorts of different experiences. Basically, like reality is this infinitely powerful domain where anything and everything can happen. If that's what reality truly is, well, then wouldn't it be possible for there to be experiences that are solipsistic, meaning that relative to those experiences, no other minds exist, but then you also have other sets of experiences relative to which solipsism is not true. And I guess that gets a little bit complicated, so maybe I should explain it just with like a simple math example, just kind of with numbers. So like if you look at the difference between a set and a superset. So let's say you have the set of the numbers 1, 2, and 3. So that's a set of numbers. It's 1, 2, and 3. Now, the superset of those 3 numbers is going to be different than the set. So see, the superset of 1, 2, and 3, that's going to include what's known as the empty set. So you have none of them. You don't have 1, you don't have 2, you don't have 3. And then you have another set of just 1 without 2 or 3, another set of just 2 without 1 or 3, and then you have the set of just 3, the set of 1 and 2, the set of 2 and 3, the set of 1 and 3, and then the full set of 1, 2, and 3. So basically a superset, it's basically just a set of sets. So if reality is like completely infinite, maybe it's not a set of phenomena, maybe it's more like a superset of phenomena where you can have different sets of experiences. So you can have these experiences where your mind is the only set of phenomena, kind of like if you just have the set of 2, right? 1 and 3, those numbers are not contained within that set because that's an exclusive set where you exclusively have the number 2 and the other 2 numbers 1 and 3 are not there. But see, you also have the other sets in addition to that. You have these other sets where you have 2 and 3 or 1 and 3 or 1, 2, and 3. So if reality is this infinite superset of phenomena, then you can have the existence of exclusive sets where, you know, you can have a genuinely solipsistic experience where your mind is exclusive, just like how the set of 2 is exclusive. 1 and 3 are counted out. And so in the same way, a genuinely solipsistic experience in that set of phenomena, there would be no other minds. So it would be an exclusive set, but at the same time, reality would still transcend that solipsism in that there would be other experiences and other sets of phenomena in which there are other minds. You do have 1, 2, and 3 instead of just 2. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. I realize it gets a bit abstract. But yeah, I hope I've, done a good enough job, using that kind of just superset example, I guess, to show how solipsism can be true, but that there can be more beyond solipsism.
Yeah, how it was arising within me, which I was kind of. Do you see this as deeply related to the relative absolute thing? Because when you were explaining sets, supersets, how that came up in me was like, right, a set is like this relative truth, and it can be completely true on the relative level, but then there's also a superset, which is, do you see like a superset as like absolute, right? A superset is the absolute. It's all possibilities of the different sets, which are true in their own relative levels, and then when combined in a superset makes the absolute. Or how do you frame that?
Yeah, definitely. I would definitely agree with that. I think the only thing is I would add this extra layer of, so like you said, when you have an exclusive set, that set is like the complete truth. So it's like it's a partial truth, it's an exclusive set, so it's only a part of the superset. So in that sense, you could say it's a partial truth, it's a relative truth, but within its own context, it's the complete truth. So you could almost say that within its own context, that relative truth becomes an absolute truth, which sounds very counterintuitive. People don't typically think that something can be simultaneously relative and absolute, but that's kind of how it would work, is that you have this relative truth or this exclusive set that within its own context is a complete truth, and therefore within its own context it's an absolute truth. And so yeah, the same thing then applies if we look up at the broader superset. It's this set of all sets, this set of all possibilities. And so in that sense, you could say it's a more complete truth. It's not partial, it's total. And so if it's complete, we could call that the absolute truth. But realize that even that broader absolute truth can ironically itself be rendered relative, because within one of those exclusive sets, the rest of the superset isn't there. It doesn't exist, right? So like within the exclusive set of 2, the set of 1 and 3 are not there. So it's like those sets aren't real. They're not true. And so it's almost like the absolute truth fails to be true within those relative contexts. So it's almost like the absolute truth can shift around. It can either be one of these exclusive sets, or it can be the broader whole set. And so it's almost like the absolute truth is not static. It's not rigid. It's flexible. It's fluid. It can move around, if that makes sense. It can be just one of the sets, or it can be the whole superset. And so it kind of just loops in on itself in a very strange way.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. In that, as soon as it seems like as soon as you try to pin down the absolute to something, then that's not it. So if you try to say this superset is the absolute, then by defining it as a superset, it's not the absolute anymore, but it's actually something else, or it's some.
Yeah.
And so this feels very related to what you were talking about in one of your videos. And this is something that I've heard in multiple different contexts, but I still have yet to feel like I have an embodied existential level understanding of it. But it's this both not true, true, true and not true, and both neither true nor true all at the same time. And you were explaining it very well in one of your videos. Do you see this as connected to what we're talking about right now? Or I mean,
Yeah, for sure. It actually goes back to this concept in Jainism, which translates to many-sidedness. I'm trying to remember the actual word for it. It's like Ananta Kabanda. Is not that. I'm kind of mispronouncing it. But yeah, there's this concept in Jainism known as many-sidedness, where yeah, you can have something be simultaneously true, not true, both, neither, etc. And so yeah, like you're saying, it's like truth is something fluid. It's not something that can be pinned down, in the sense that it doesn't apply to all cases. And now some people will like bring up an objection to this and say, well, the truth that this earth we're standing on is round, that's a static truth. So it's like, well, Ethan, how could you say that truth is fluid? And so that's the thing, is that if truth is fluid, it's going to contain instances in which it is rigid and consistent, right? Like fluidity contains within it the possibility of rigidity, where things can kind of hold. So, it goes back to the thing of like an infinite reality, where it's more like a superset of phenomena. Well, within a superset of phenomena, you could have a consistent set of phenomena that arises within that superset. So you can have a consistent set of laws of physics arise. And so that's why our universe would be like composed of all these physical constants that scientists study. And so that's why the earth would be around for everybody. So, just because I'm saying that truth is fluid, does not mean that there cannot be truths that hold some level of consistency. It would just mean that somewhere else out in reality, it's not true to say that this earth is flat. Like, we could go into like a multiverse theory and say like, maybe there's other dimensions where this earth is not round. And so relative to those physical universes, it would be not only true, but physically rigorously true to say that the earth is flat in those realms. And so right there, you see that, well, the earth is simultaneously round and flat, because it's round in one case, but then in this other case, in this other context, it's flat. So yeah, it goes back to that Jainist concept of many-sidedness, where something can be true, not true, both, right? So it can be true that the earth is round. It can be not true in this other context where it's flat. And then if you kind of have like both contexts there, if you're kind of surveying both overlapping each other, then you could have both. Maybe there's a completely different context out there where it's neither round nor flat. And so, yeah, you just get all these overlapping, overlaying truths that are rigorously, even physically, scientifically true, but yet even so, there's still a fluidity of truth there. So it gets very interesting how deep it can go.
No, this is so fascinating, because this is what I noticed in myself. I've been grappling with this for a long time, the relative nature of truth, right? Which is like, there's a lot of, I think it's kind of the most popular or seemingly leading edge kind of way of perceiving truth in our culture is like this, to just make everything relative and pluralistic, and to just say like, oh, well, that's true in your context. In my context, I have a different truth, and that person has a different truth, right? And it makes us, and whenever I inhabit that space, it creates this very like overwhelming feeling, you know, of like, oh, well, you can't ever pin down truth to anything absolute, and it's just always relative, and it's never actually true. And we spoke in the last podcast about spiral dynamics, and being familiar with spiral dynamics, it's almost just what I hear you explaining is like, all right, most people perceive what we were saying from this very stage green level of like, all right, all truth is relative, right? So all truth, if it's my truth, it's my truth. If it's your truth, it's your truth. If someone says the earth is round, that's their truth. And then in another context or another dimension, whatever, it may not be, or you can use it for any argument, anything anyone says, right? But then you get to this kind of stage yellow perspective, and even stage turquoise perspective, which is much more, I think, what you were kind of describing there, which was like, all right, yes, truth is relative, but in some contexts, it's actually absolute. So depending on what context you look at it, it can be either relative or absolute, and it's always shifting. And like every truth is relative on some level, but if you view it in a different context, there can be absolute and rigid and very structured, firmly true things, right? And so
yeah, exactly. And I like that you bring up the example of stage green compared to like yellow or turquoise there, because this is sort of like a stage green problem that we're finding right now in our culture, since stage green is becoming more popular and more prominent, especially in first world countries like America or all the European countries. You're finding this extreme relativism where you'll hear these stage green people say, well, to a flat earther, the earth is flat. And it's like, well, not necessarily, because a flat earther can believe that the earth is flat while being wrong, right? Like they could be standing on a round earth believing that it's flat. That's another possibility that exists, that you can be wrong about the planet that you're standing on. So just because a flat earther believes the earth is flat does not make it flat. This is a trap that a lot of stage green relativists fall into. They have this very floppy, sort of unnuanced type of relativism where it's like, well, if the flat earther believes it, then it's true for them. And then, like you said, no, that's not necessarily the case, because you move up into stage yellow or turquoise, and it's like, well, it's still possible to be wrong about your own truth. You could think that your truth is that you're here standing on a flat earth, when really you're actually standing on a round earth. So yes, truth is relative. Yes, everybody can have their own truth, but it's also still possible to be wrong about your own truth. That's a very stage yellow type of perspective. It's a more rigorous type of relativism.
Right.
So a stage green person would say, well, if that flat earther were to get taken up into space, they would see a flat earth. It would actually be flat for them. A stage yellow person would be like, no, come on, ground your senses a little bit. If we take a flat earther up into space, they're gonna see a round earth. They're gonna get proven wrong, but it's still true in some context to say that the earth is flat, because we then travel to another dimension where the earth is actually physically flat, then yes, they will get taken up into space in that other dimension, and they will see a genuinely flat Earth. So yeah, I like that form of relativism better, just because it doesn't fall into the same traps as, like the stage green relativism. It's more, I guess it's more honest, really. Like it's a little dishonest to just say, well, if a flat earther gets taken up into space, they're going to see a flat Earth. Like you're kind of just not really being honest with how things work.
Right.
So yeah, it's a little more transparent. So I like that about it. Yeah.
Yeah, it feels like it's a little bit more rigorous and nuanced in its understanding. And I'm still, as you're speaking about that, I feel like I grasp it, but there's also components of it that I'm still kind of having a hard time pinning down, because it's much more complex and nuanced, right? To say in some context there is absolute truth, and some there's relative. It's also like sometimes we can get just lost in the words, which has been something I've been trying to stay mindful of, is like, all right, when do we have the same definitions of relative, absolute, context, like solipsism? Like, let's make sure we get on the same page with these before we start talking about them too. And there's something here around like what I'm not sure actually where to go. I actually there was a lot here, and there's so many different directions we can go in this conversation. I'm very curious to hear, I guess, what's coming up right now, which we'll just see what emerges out of this, is if you're interested in talking about the limits of green and potentially ways of, I think this is very interesting intersection here. I've been fascinated by the limits of green for a long time. And I think what you were speaking about at the beginning of the podcast is very related to this in the metaspirituality thing, right? Because sometimes the limits of green can kind of hinder us from perceiving different types of people in this meta spiritual way, in which someone that's deeply scientific or skeptical can also have just as much of an ability to be spiritual and to be grounded in different things than we do. And I see the biggest trap of this unhealthy stage green, the limits of stage green, is like, all right, I'm super relativistic, but at the same time, I'm not able to understand the contradiction that I see other groups of people as being less valuable than I am, or like they see, all right, this is conservative perspective, there's this materialist skeptical perspective, and sometimes that perspective is actually seen as being less right, because there's this groundedness in everyone in first tier in stage green or below is like, I think I'm right and other people are wrong, right? So to take relativism fully, it would be like, all right, even the skeptic and the rationalist and the conservative, they have just as if we take relativism to its extreme, they have just as much value in that perspective, right? Their perspective is equally as valuable, because that's what relative truth is, right? It's my truth is relative and their truth is relative, and they both are valuable. I'm trying to understand this in terms of metaspirituality, and I think you may be able to provide some insight. Say we take true relativism, like, all right, the conservative or the rationalist or the skeptic has just as much truth on a relative level as I do, right? They have some aspect of reality that they're seeing that has truth, and to say that they're wrong and my relative perspective is better than theirs is actually like not really maintaining the integrity of the pluralism and the relativism, right? And so so then going into stage yellow, how do we kind of like understand that and then bring it into this meta spirituality in stage yellow of saying, all right, everyone has truth. In some contexts, though, the conservative is less right? And so there's kind of like this deeper nuance and complexity and integrity that's brought into the picture here with this meta spirituality. So I'm curious what's coming up for you.
Yeah, definitely. So like you were saying with green, it's not like a full relativism, because they're failing to be relativistic with their own relativism, which, to take relativism to the full extent is to also embrace certain rigid absolutist conceptions of truth, because relativism is essentially inclusive of absolutism. So the stage green people, they're kind of only going halfway with it. they're accepting relativism, but only to the degree that it doesn't render their own relativism relative, which is something that you kind of have to transcend to really get into the full-on relativism and multi-perspectivism that you see with yellow. And because a lot of stage green people aren't doing that, because they're not transcending that sort of half-baked relativism, that's why you'll see a lot of stage green quote unquote hippies kind of demonizing science, because they look at science as this absolutist infrastructure. It's this bad kind of institution that's sort of threatening to their notion of relativism. Like scientists are saying that, no, it's definite that the earth is round, and stage green people are like, well, no, that's wrong. To a flat earther, it's flat. But then you go up into yellow and it's like, well, no, certain materialistic, scientific, sort of rigid truths, they can be true in their own context as well. It's possible for a flat earther to live on a round earth. So stage yellow does not hate on science and skepticism as much as green does, because it sees that there's a place at the table, so to speak. It's this broader relativism that leaves room for absolutist conceptions of truth that you find not just from scientists and materialists, but even religious people. So like, actually, I won't go off into an example there. That'll be too much of a tangent. But yeah, it allows room for these rigid conceptions of truth in addition to the more fluid relativistic ones. And so the way that ties into the notion of metaspirituality is that it's possible to actually connect spirituality to other fields through that. Because see, in stage green, it's sort of this spiritual purism. Like, we only accept spirituality and sort of relative conceptions of truth, but we don't accept science, we don't accept materialism, we don't accept these non-spiritual conceptions of truth. Whereas you go up into yellow and spirituality actually kind of broadens to include the non-spiritual fields. It broadens to include science, and so you can actually connect spirituality to science now. Like, what's the relationship between spiritual truths that we can't measure empirically and scientific truths such as the shape of the earth, which we are most definitely able to measure empirically? So like, there's this relationship there between empirical truths and non-empirical truths. And again, they kind of both have a seat at the table. It's just a broader, more inclusive, I guess you could say, conception of truth overall. Not necessarily more true, but definitely broader for sure, since it's more inclusive.
Right. Yeah, this is really good stuff.
Yeah. Actually, and another thing that I will add on there, this actually is not something that I just noticed with stage green spiritual people. I actually do notice it a lot with some turquoise people, that they'll kind of denounce materialism or they'll denounce science and kind of go down this purely holistic route. Because if you study the spiral dynamics model, that's like one of the key words of turquoise is holism, this oneness, this awareness of the oneness of reality. And some turquoise people will reach that holistic state of mind, and it'll lead them to kind of denounce duality or materialism or stuff like that. So ironically, it is something that you'll see a lot of turquoise people fall into as well. They'll kind of see the holism as the only truth, but then they'll denounce everything else as illusory. Like, your body is illusory, your life is illusory. You'll hear a lot of turquoise gurus say this, that everything's just an illusion. And now, again, that's not false, because again, reality, if it's infinite, it's going to contain context in which, yes, it's true that those things are genuine illusions, but there's also going to be other contexts where duality is a genuine truth, and your ego is a genuine phenomenon, and your life is a valid real thing. So you almost kind of have to even go further than turquoise to really make sure that all these complexities and nuances are able to fit in there.
Yeah. And I would almost even say that's an unhealthy version of turquoise, or potentially, I think there's potentially the possibility that what you were describing there is potentially a green person being grounded in a state of non-duality, but still having that unhealthy green pluralism, right? And so, yeah, where I wanted to go from this is, yeah, so I sense there's this understanding, this shared understanding that we have that I want to explore around holism, right? And so to be truly holistic is to include the religious fundamentalist, the rational scientific materialist, the pluralist, and everything. And I would say if you don't do that, I would say that how I currently understand it, what you were just describing wouldn't actually be turquoise, right? Because if it doesn't actually include all of the previous stages, then it's more like not even fully embodied in stage yellow yet, because like one of the characteristics of yellow and turquoise is it must include all of the previous ones, and it must actually integrate that level of holism, right? So I'm super curious how, because we spoke earlier at the beginning about science. I'm super curious how you're approaching the integration of scientific truths, right? As part of this systemic, like there's truth in that. It's not, and this, I've heard it explained very well by this guy named Daniel Schmachtenberger. He's like, it's not just that like, hey, I'm at a higher, more inclusive, broader perspective of reality, and so therefore like the stage blue, the other conceptions and paradigms are wrong. It's that there's some actual signal, there's some actual truth, right? And this is what we were speaking before, like from their perspective, that is absolute truth, right? So I'm very curious in exploring this area of, all right, what is that, like the actual absolute truth, the actual like real truth, even if it's just partial. What is like the actual real truth of, I think the most interesting route is like the scientific materialism and just science at large. I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts on this domain of like science and spirituality and all this stuff.
Yeah, so if you look at the claims about what truth is from the scientific community and you compare it to the more spiritual or even non-dual communities, you'll see two different sets of claims. Scientists will say that truths are constant, right? Like, so they'll point out the physical constants that operate in our cosmos. So like the law of gravity, that's a constant. That's not just relative. That's something that's been there for as long as we can tell, probably throughout the entire history of this cosmos. And so it's constant, it's not fluid, you can pin it down. So basically, like a scientist would say that you are able to pin down truth. It's essentially rigid. And then you look at the claims about what truth is like from the other side, from the spiritual community, they're going to say, no, you cannot pin down truth. Truth is fluid, it's not rigid. So yeah, how do you integrate these two sets of claims? Well, I always like to use, just the infinite multiverse example, just because I think it really does do a good job at integrating these two. But I mean, you could look at the fact of, okay, well, these physical constants, yes, they do operate in our universe. Yes, they're rigid. Yes, you can pin them down. They are truths that you are able to pin down in a rigid fashion. But again, maybe our cosmos is not the totality of reality, right? Like there's all sorts of facets of reality that we have yet to discover scientifically, and that science may never have the tools to access or discover. Like we still have no way of accessing other people's subjective experiences. So, like neuroscientists, they're able to study the brain, they're able to study like your state of mind, look at your brain waves and kind of how all the neurons are firing. They can study that, but neuroscientists still don't have a way of actually accessing a person's subjective experience. They don't have a way of actually looking at it and kind of putting it up on a screen. Because I mean, wouldn't it be cool if someday we could actually like put a dream that you had last night up on a screen, where it's like, oh, I had this really cool dream last night, you got to see it, and you kind of just flash it up on a screen and you can actually analyze a person's dream. But see, we're still far away from that ever being developed, even if it does ever become developed. So we may never have a way of accessing somebody's subjective experience through a scientific method. And even if we do, we're most definitely not anywhere close to that. So subjective experience, that's one facet of reality that science cannot pin down with physical constants, at least not yet. So there's an opportunity right there for truth to be fluid. Maybe when it comes to the physical constants of the cosmos, maybe truth is something rigid, but when it comes to something like subjective experience, maybe truth is not so rigid, maybe it's fluid. But even if we go back to like this multiverse example, even things like the laws of physics and physical constants, even those rigid truths can be rendered into fluid and flexible ones, because there are serious, credible physicists right now who are saying that there may be other universes with different physical laws and different physical constants. So even if something is a cosmic law, like it is so rigid and so constant that it holds throughout the entire cosmos as this broad cosmic law, even that might be rendered into something relative and variable if there are other universes out there where the physical constants are different. So see right there, you have this opportunity for truth to again be both rigid and fluid. So it's like you can pin down the constants of our cosmos in a rigid, truthful fashion. But then if there's infinitely many other universes out there, you're also going to have infinitely many other laws of physics. So the truth is always going to be variable. You can't pin down one set of physical constants or one set of truths and say, this is the ultimate truth, because it's going to be context dependent. It's going to depend on which universe or which facet of reality you're talking about. So I think that right there, to kind of, I guess, circle this back around to the whole point of the question, that right there can integrate the two claims that we see on both sides of the aisle. We have scientists saying that truth is a constant, truth is something that we are able to pin down, and then we have these more spiritual people saying that no, truth is something fluid, it's variable, it cannot be pinned down. And so, you know, different contexts would essentially allow for both of those to be true in their own respects.
Yeah, so as you were speaking, I was sensing into this space of kind of like, what's the point? I guess that's not the best. That's not the most, like, that doesn't get at the essence of it. But it's like, all right, so we're talking absolute relative. All right, let's say kind of to take it even one more step meta is like, all right, and I realized that this isn't really like a, it's like, what's the point of life, right? What's the point of absolute relative? There's no really answer to that, right? But on one context, it's like, I'm curious to hear, if you take it meta, how do you perceive the absolute relative thing in terms of the relative pragmatic approach to this world, this reality, humanity at large, right? And kind of how I'm sensing into it is like, the better we understand this yellow altitude perspective of perceiving the world, right? It's like, all right, the more we're able to go be fluid between these relative and absolute truths, and to not think that our one absolute or our one relative truth is right in all the and to the exclusion of all else. It feels like there's like this level of wholeness there, right? So I'm very curious how you understand that in terms of how does this help humanity to better understand relative and absolute, right? Because if there's not that understanding, it feels like, all right, well, then why would I do the work to kind of develop this complexity, this cognitive, this being level complexity, right? And of moving between science and spirituality and all these different things, you know?
Yeah, so that kind of draws back to what you said earlier about how, once you reach turquoise, it's not that stage blue is wrong or even necessarily less true. It's just that turquoise is a broader truth, right? So it's this more inclusive set of truths or superset of truths, however you want to put it. So basically, what that means is that if you learn about and study these broader truths, you're going to be studying a broader, more inclusive set or superset of phenomena. And that is actually very useful for humankind to do, because the broader the set of phenomena that we study, the more we're going to know, and on top of it, the more we're going to be able to enhance our own lives and enhance the lives of humanity in general, right? Like, so basically, the more knowledge or the broader the understanding you have, the more you're able to do with it, right? So a broader set of knowledge, a broader set of consciousness or awareness is going to allow you to do more things. Like if you want to learn how to feed all the starving people in third world countries, you have to broaden your set of knowledge and be able to study that set of phenomenon as to how to get that done. Your set of knowledge has to be inclusive of that. So I would say that the purpose of attaining these higher truths and becoming conscious of them is not to harmonize yourself with something that's more true, but to come into contact with something that is a broader truth. It's a more inclusive truth that allows you to understand a broader set of phenomenon, which in turn gives you more resources to enhance your life and enhance the lives of others. And so I think that also kind of ties into the pragmatics behind it that you were talking about. So there actually is a very pragmatic element to broadening your conception of truth.
Right, right. It seems like the core of that, it's like there's this reconciliation between things that seem paradoxical and contradictory into this higher order synthesis or reconciliation. That's kind of how I've understood moving up the spiral in like the core evolutionary process. So yeah, how that really came up for me was just like, it seems like there's just this desire within on an existential level to I think Ken Wilber uses the phrase, which is like creative advance into novelty, to have this advance into novel ways of synthesizing and reconciling seemingly contradictory ways of viewing the world. And yeah, man, I mean, that's about it for what I have. I guess there's also this one other way of framing this that I would like to bring up too, actually. So you hear of like, all right, so there's all these different like stage blue dynamics happening where like different tribes are fighting against each other. Like a lot of people that are very pluralist, right? Stage green, they actually like their emotional component is still like stage blue, where it's like, all right, I'm stage green, but like if you don't believe me, then like get the fuck out, which is like a very stage blue, like most like, because like you can be developed in different lines, right? And so something that I heard that was fascinating, which I think ties into what we were talking about, is how do you truly develop this world-centric perspective, right? So the only way to have like a tribal ethnocentric perspective is to realize that there's another tribe out there. And then if I realize there's a tribe out there, then I feel more connected to my tribe, right? If there was no tribe out there, then I would fight with people within my tribe because I wouldn't have that unity, that shared coherence within the tribe. And so what you're talking about with this absolute relative truth thing, which is like, all right, potentially if you take it to the level of dimensions of consciousness, on this dimension of consciousness, the world surrounds. Potentially there's a different dimension of consciousness where the world isn't round, right? And so I've heard it explained very interesting, which is like, all right, potentially a way to develop coherence and unity among every like of the humanity in this world that we're in right now is to show that there's other dimensions of consciousness, and that actually provides the perspective of other, right? All right, there's other dimensions of consciousness. Now I feel more connected to everyone in this dimension, right? In the yeah,
definitely. It does seem like human history has tended to work that way, that there's all this infighting within a group until another group comes along. Then it's like, oh, now we've got to unify, we've got to put aside our differences or accept our differences and band up against this other tribe, this foreign tribe. And then that transcends, you have this set of tribe that unifies once you come into contact with another nation of tribes. And so, yeah, that does seem to be a trend that is at work throughout human history, that the broader the context becomes, the more unification that happens. So, I would kind of think that this could tend to infinity. Like you said, all of humanity would unify if we discovered other not just other dimensions and other worlds, but I think honestly, if we scientifically prove that there's other life out there or other sentient, human-like forms of consciousness, everybody would unify, and then maybe all those worlds would unify if something even broader was discovered, and then all those broader facets would unify if something yet even broader was discovered. And so that's kind of like the beauty of an infinite reality, is that there's always broader and broader facets, and so there's always broader levels of unification happening as the new facets get discovered.
Right. Yeah. I actually had that. Yeah. I had the same thought as I was thinking about it earlier. As I was speaking, it was like, yeah, then who says there can't be even broader ones? And I guess that goes back to the infinite nature of reality, which is fascinating. Something else related to the scientific one, the scientific paradigm and way, this very rational way of viewing the world. And I'm curious how this comes up for you is, so there's a demonization in the stage green communities of the mind, or we spoke about this at the beginning of the call. There's oftentimes this demonization of the mind is bad, the ego is bad, all these things are bad, right? But I've actually, which I don't agree with anymore either. I don't think the ego is entirely bad. I don't think the mind is entirely bad. There's a lot of benefits to it. One way that has come up for me recently, which I've been really contemplating, is transperspectival mind or transparadigmatic mind. Basically what I mean by that is the mind, a lot of people define it, or the ego, as being attached to a certain paradigm, and it's not very holistic, right? It's not very inclusive. If I'm only attached onto this one paradigm, then I'm not including other paradigms and other possibilities and partial truths within other paradigms. So let's say we define mind and ego as being attached, or especially ego being attached to a paradigm and not being able to let it go. Potentially and I think it's very hard because it just depends how you define these words, right? But it's the transparadigmatic mind is all right, I'm going to be the witness of all of these different paradigms. And if you define the mind as just being able to use concepts, being able to use the intellect, right? Then that's not bad, right? You can there's actually this possibility of coming from this space of transperspectival mind where I am able to try on and operate within certain paradigms, and then whenever the context is not right and that paradigm is no longer valuable, and I can just drop it and just put on a different paradigm and speak through that, and speak through the truth, the absolute truth within that paradigm. And then when the context shifts and that's no longer absolutely true, then I just try. And so there's this sense of who I am, the existence of who I am is not actually wrapped up in any one paradigm, right? But it's actually the witness of these changing paradigms and the changing contexts, the changing truths within them. And I'm sure if that brings anything up for you.
Yeah, that definitely works. Yeah, it's almost like you could have a flexible ego, or a flexible set of perspectives where you kind of change with the context, different contexts and different scenarios call for different approaches. And so, I would definitely agree with that. But also too, you also would make sure that you're trying to cultivate the healthy aspects of each of those approaches, and kind of leaving aside the negatives, because of course, throughout all those various perspectives and approaches, as with every perspective or paradigm or approach, there's going to be positives and negatives. So as you're kind of moving around between all those contexts, you try and maximize the healthy aspects of them and minimize the negatives, I would definitely say.
Right. It's just kind of this sense of integrating the partial truths. It's every one of those has truth, but it also has false, right? And so what is the partial truth within that I can actually operate with and be? And and perhaps if you view that as ego, as I'm going to operate in this paradigm, as the partial truth, that partial full truth of this paradigm, then I can actually operate as an ego healthily right within that. I think it's very, very fascinating take on that's sometimes not fully understood. Yeah, I'm curious if you have anything else. I think I kind of sense the conversation slowly winding down. I'm curious if there's anything else you want to add, or if
I think this is a good spot to actually bring the conversation full circle. That if you look at how there's all these different contexts where you can apply different truths or different approaches and take that more holistic, integrative approach. If you really look at that, I mean, that kind of ties back to the whole core concept or core topic of metaspirituality, where you have all these different spiritual paths that you can utilize depending on the context. In one context, it's good to pursue non-duality. Like if you're trying to transcend your ego mind and discover truths beyond your own biases, like you're trying to make sure that your own ego biases don't filter the truths that you're able to discover. If that's what you're trying to pursue, then in that context, non-duality is a very good spiritual path. But if, again, going back to the example of astral projection, if you're trying to just learn a skill set like that, then in that context, a more new age spiritual approach would be good. And then a scientific approach would be good for looking at like the physical, pragmatic aspects of our world. And so, like all these different fields and topics, both within spirituality and beyond spirituality, they all, like you said, they have their own truths and they have their own falsehoods. So you got to try and maximize the truth value of each one so that you can more effectively utilize each one. And that allows you to get closer to the truth. And not only that, it allows you to use the truth to enhance quality of life for yourself and the world at large. And so I would say that's basically the cap of the entire message.
Hell yeah. That's a great way to end it. Yeah, there's something around, if I want to be in greatest service to humanity, there's kind of this necessity to develop this meta spirituality, this meta perspectival understanding the partial truths and everything, going kind of beyond pluralism. I think that's very that's a perfect way to wrap it up.
For sure.
Sweet.